Hello, everybody. My name is Daniel Bélan, and I'm the director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada here at McGill University. I'm really happy to be with you today. I would like to start by acknowledging that while we meet today on a virtual platform, McGill University is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. We do this to acknowledge the importance of the land on which we work, study, and live, and to acknowledge the complex web of relationships of which we are a part. The McGill Institute for the Study of Canada is the Center for Canadian, Quebec, and Indigenous Studies programs at McGill University. MISC, as it's known, supports a multidisciplinary approach to the study of Canada by bringing together students, researchers, and practitioners to discuss important issues about the country's past, present, and future. In addition to our academic programs, MISC also hosts public events such as this panel today on a wide range of topics that are important to Canadians. Also want to mention, if you go online on Twitter and Facebook, you can also access our new podcast. So this is a novelty, and that's part of our mission in terms of outreach. Please note that today's event is being recorded, and we will be posting the recording on the MISC YouTube channel next week. Please also make sure that your microphones are muted in order to avoid any interruptions. If you have questions, you can use the chat box, and I will read the questions later to the panelists after they have spoken. Pour commencer, laissez-moi vous présenter Patrik Marier, le docteur Patrik Marier. Patrik, qui est professeur de sciences politiques à l'Université Concordia et qui est aussi le chercheur principal pour le projet VIE du FRQSC. Qui est spécialisé, donc Patrik et ce projet VIE, cette équipe VIE se spécialise dans l'exclusion sociale et le vieillissement. In his new book, The Four Lenses of Population Aging, Planning for the Future of Canada's Provinces, Patrik Marier looks at how Canada's 10 provinces are preparing for an aging society. It's a book grounded in really a lot of field work all across the country in all the 10 provinces. Really impressive work. And today we are really happy to have, in addition to Patrik Marier, will say a few words about this book, Jonathan Kraft, an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto, and Laura Funk, who is a professor in the Department of Sociology and Criminology at the University of Manitoba. So the way to proceed today is that Patrik will start the discussion, then by saying, having really a few general points that he will formulate about his book and why he wrote it. And then Jonathan, followed by Laura, will each give their remarks for about 12 minutes each. And then we'll go back to Patrik, who will answer the comments from Jonathan and Laura. And finally, we'll have a moderated Q&A, really moderated Q&A with our panelists, questions directed primarily at Patrik Marier. And I will be moderating that session. So Patrik, you can start. It's all yours. Thanks again for accepting our invitation to participate in that panel today.
Thank you, Danielle. Thank you to Blair, the MISC, and many thanks to both Laura and Jonathan for agreeing to do this, which I think it makes it a far more interesting and dynamic book launch and presentation. So I just wanted to say a few words. So this book was actually over a decade in the making. So for those who know me quite well, my original training was primarily in comparative public policy, and especially Europe, some may want to say, especially in Scandinavia. And I wanted to do something very different with regards to the funding, the Canadian funding I was receiving. And I felt that, oh, well, maybe I should do something more invested in Canada. And I came up with this idea of doing a comparative book of all 10 provinces with a view on how public authorities plan for an aging society. So to do this, which is also based with my earlier training, so I focused a lot on senior civil servants. So ministers, they come and go, but civil servants remain and continue to exercise an important influence over the policy-making process. So as part of this research, so I visited every provincial capitals and visited over 125 officials in total. And I focus on key departments such as finance, health, social services, community affairs, executive council, and also the gender office, which tend to have a very good horizontal view of the issues in the civil service. So my journey as a scientific director for the Center for Research and Expertise and Social Gerontology, which began in 2013, and my involvement with the V team that Danielle just mentioned actually had a profound impact on the theoretical underpinnings and the content of this book, which is also being one of the primary source of the delays in publication. First, when I moved into social gerontology and social services for older adults, I must admit that it was a big culture shock. So it turns out that the world of pension policy is very different than the ones that focuses on services to older adults and the world of health and social services in general. So I left primarily a world composed of actuaries, lawyers, regulators, pension fund managers, to one where I ended up interacting with social workers, nurses, community organizers, managers, and as we refer to in Quebec, the réseau, which refers to the health and social services network. Ended up interacting with social gerontologists, which are very different scholars than the ones who work in pensions. So this divide goes well beyond the professionalization and the gender imbalance of these two sectors. We actually, in many ways, are polar opposite. The organizational culture is also very different. I was, for instance, taken aback by the rigid hierarchy of the health sector and the marginalization of social policy and services within the ministry. So it is this culture shock that is at the root of the four lenses that compose this book. So there were two noticeable sources of inspiration for the lenses. First, I was very much drawn back to my IR, international relations studies, and the interpretations that we use of Lakatos to comprehend how research programs continue to flourish and compete with one another. So this is this traditional debate between the neoliberal institutionalists and the neorealists and so on. And I thought that was far more applicable than those ideas where we tend to think about frames as being fluids and one gets to dominate another one and the one disappears. When in fact, I wanted to really put forth that these lenses do not disappear. They remain strongly anchored within the civil service and with regards to how we actually conceptualize and think about population aging. The other is a constant pressure I face in my daily life when I go out hiking and I bring my camera lenses. I always end up being forced to making difficult choices to which one I need to bring. This is, in a way, a metaphor about the constrained policy perspective that comes with professional training and our consequences of the organization of the civil service. So each of the four lenses, the intergenerational, the medical, the social gerontology, and organizational lens, result in very different problem formulation, sometimes divergence, other time complementary with one another. And this also results in the use and the preference for very different policy instrument. So in closing, I want also to stress and mention that in many ways also represents my policy journey so far. So when I began my career, my first interest was really the importance of the budgetary process and the role of finance ministry. And then I delved into pensions, and now I'm involved in much broader issue affecting older adults. And I'm particularly now interested in and devote a lot of my time on issues related to long-term care and home care. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Patrick. Now we'll move to Laura Funk, who has a presentation and some slides to share. So Laura, it's all yours.
Great, thank you. Let's just give me a minute here to pull this up and play. Everyone can see that all right? Okay, great. And thank you, Patrik, for inviting me to speak today. Your book, obviously, to me at least, fills an important gap at an important time. And I've appreciated reading it and learning a lot personally, even from it, from your analyses. And I hope to use parts of it in future courses that I teach. So today I'm just going to touch on some points of comment and some things I wanted to respond to or extend or raise further kinds of questions about. Great. And so I'll start off with three key strengths that were apparent to me. And one is obviously the focus on the need for long-term planning and how that comes along with some very concrete suggestions for how to enhance and expand capacity in the civil service for that long-term planning and what might some of the barriers be. You've illuminated the predominance of the ad hoc, the incremental, and piecemeal responses to population aging. And so that was very helpful. And then the next, oops. I think you've also highlighted that persistence, often among folks that you interviewed, I believe, that the kind of the sky is falling scenario, or what we call apocalyptic demography, and that the aging population is going to bring down our healthcare system because of the costs and so on. And you've presented, you've said that this is persisting even despite some evidence that population aging is not the only or nor the most important determinant of, say, particularly increases in healthcare costs. And so that was really helpful. That's something, for instance, I try in my own classes to teach students about. And I guess a question arises about how we can continue to challenge that. Is it that policymakers need more training and more evidence in this, or is it an ideological justification used to kind of align with what is a very widely held public assumption as well? Great. And then a third strength or sort of takeaway message from the book, I think, because of the critique of the dominance of the medical lens, is maybe how can we reclaim a social lens? And in terms of how we can do that, you've highlighted that role of the senior secretariats, although they're sort of weaker, and New Brunswick's sort of model as well of putting things within a social sort of department or ministry. So those are certainly some options, and I think those are really well laid out. We can think of extensions to, what about drastically shifting even models of home care and long-term residential care themselves? So things like the Burt-Sorg model or the butterfly or greenhouse model. And those, initially we might say that policymakers might not want to make such drastic shifts, but in my experience, policymakers or politicians at least perhaps are often a fan of sort of putting their mark on things and engaging in wide scale transformation and reorganization. So I don't think that's necessarily that much a pie in the sky kind of idea. And then I'm interested to think about, or we could discuss later, the effects of the COVID pandemic on this. Is it the case that the pandemic has highlighted the importance of things like quality of life and social needs? Or is it going to be the case that ongoing concerns about contagion and risk and so on are going to continue to be used sort of to limit particularly public services to just the most sort of essential kinds of needs? I know home care in Manitoba was still not fully sort of reinstated for many folks, and it's still that focus on just the most essential medical sorts of needs that has persisted. Another strength of the book is the value of that comparative approach that really comes through and is much needed. And, that showing us how things could be otherwise and why, and particularly by doing that between the provinces. So that I found really helpful. And I think that there is value in that comparison of these four lenses, but I wondered if there was maybe some reification of those lenses, right? Can we get a better sense sometimes of what actors are behind the kind of giving these lenses certain kinds of agency, what maybe vested interest might be involved? And then for me, maybe because I'm not coming from a policy perspective, I wondered about that fit of the organizational lens. It's sort of like it's almost often its own to me as kind of a focus less on the substantive issues and more on that process piece, but that could be an opportunity for discussion too. And then I'm still struggling a little bit with what those four lenses represent. I mean, in some ways, You've talked about them as conceptualizations or ways of understanding the problems and solutions. I'm wondering too about, embedded values and beliefs and maybe political views that sometimes you've alluded to. Is it more about how how civil servants or public actors are sort of strategically framing certain actions? And then to what extent does evidence sort of, do these represent sort of clear evidence, places of evidence? I do think the lenses are really helpful for perhaps prompting decision makers to engage in that kind of reflexive thinking on their own positionalities. And then the question arises maybe around how to deal with contradictory evidence between lenses. And I'm just going to flag this briefly, but I really got stuck on this because I'm not coming from a political science perspective. So this idea that older adults have a political advantage or there's a potential for a gerontocracy was like, whoa, that seemed to go against everything that I'd read and been trained in. So, and yet, is there contradictory evidence maybe that between these sort of two views? We talk a lot in social gerontology about ageism towards older adults as being quite institutionalized within cultures and structures. And we know that administrative offices for seniors were to sort of develop to address a gap in advocacy and input of older adults into policy, and yet we know they're sort of weak and struggling as well. So sort of to what extent is there power among older adults, and or to what extent does the kind of focus on gray power obscure important differences as well? And then I want to focus on two key pieces, which for me are close to my heart, which is the home care and the family caregiving pieces. And so the chapter on home care and family caregiving is really good. I find it very helpful. And you flagged this idea that there's this gap between the rhetoric around aging in place and investment. And you've suggested a few sort of explanations for why that is. Obviously, the dominance of the medical model and lens, the Canada Health Act, and the sort of crowding out that can happen, and the vicious circle you sort of flagged around how that can actually, you develop less attention to prevention and create more problems. Potentially vested interests in terms of medicalization. So certainly that would be key. I think also you flagged that maybe this is about poor planning and budgeting around population aging, so that could possibly explain it. And it's especially sort of the budget piece I remember came out and financing came through quite clearly. The lack of clarity and consensus on home care, how is it defined, even between provinces, and I'd add that kind of its purpose as well. What are we expecting and hoping to gain from home care? What is its purpose? And I think this is alluded to, but I'll flag it maybe more directly also that, we've seen several shifts along the lines of sort of more austerity and neoliberalism over the last several decades. And there's vested interests involved in, if we don't properly fund public home care, then that opens up space for private home care. And so there might be some vested interests at play there as well. And I'll put this one up here to be provocative, but that idea that, is this ageism, is it ableism, is it sexism, and assuming that that women are going to be providing this care, are there aspects of racism in terms of low pay for home care workers? And even if policymakers and politicians themselves aren't overtly immersed in these kinds of discriminatory biases, the gap, I think, between the rhetoric and the investment can be read or signal to the public that, at the very least, what we value or don't value as a society. I'm also going to flag the idea that maybe this is part of the problem is a lack of, or low public and community advocacy or mobilization, and particularly movements that are based on solidarity across groups of people receiving home care, family caregiver groups, and workers groups as well. So maybe that helps explain the gap or something that could be addressed to help change it. Will lessons that we learned from COVID prompt sort of solutions in this regard, or prompt more investment? that's just something I wanted to flag. We've seen a lot more attention to home care because people don't want to go into long-term residential care, but we have yet to see if that's going to really start to shift in terms of funding priorities. And then the last piece is around that gap. I think there's a similar gap between the rhetoric and investments in unpaid family caregivers that you've flagged as well. And so even despite that kind of rhetorical emphasis on recognizing family caregivers, you've flagged how the measures to support them remain fairly marginal, weak or insubstantial, difficult to access, and rely heavily on the nonprofit sector. And how you've talked about how caregiving is increasingly instrumentalized as sort of resources or free labor for the healthcare systems. So even in the pandemic, we know that few provinces have put in extra supports in this regard. And so what explains this? And I'm not sure that you talk about it as much, so I just wanted to flag again, it could be, as if you've noted with regards to home care, it could be, again, about poor planning and thinking and, you know, realizing that there might not down the road, there might not be actually enough family members or caregivers available to do this work. Again, it could be about the private interests involved. If we don't support family caregivers enough, more of them might have to reach out to private sources of care to help alleviate any particular burdens they might experience. Is it, you know, in some provinces we have some strong independent caregiver advocacy groups, in others we don't, which got me thinking on a separate line around, do those provinces with stronger groups have more tangible caregiver supports? Possibly. And again, these kinds of ideas, assumptions made about women's role and even about cultural sort of preferences or capacities might come into it as well. Again, will COVID-19 and the various reports that have come out in this regard help prompt some investment? And I'm coming up in 12 minutes, so I'll end on my last slide, which was, you've touched briefly on that Lifecourse approach and sort of encompassed it within social gerontology, but I think that's the other key takeaway for me, at least from the book, was the need for a Lifecourse approach that helps us go beyond just conceptualizing population aging as affecting older adults or as an older adults kind of issue. You know, there's a broad range of government programs and policies that shape populations across a life course. Do we have policy capacity and research capacity for this, the longitudinal data, and the ability to take that longitudinal data and really do some kind of embedded, like thinking about and embedding that data and what's happening within those cohorts to the political context or the policy context would be really important. And I believe that is all of my slides. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. Now we turn to Jonathan Kraft. Again, you have 12 minutes to present your thoughts about Patrik Marier's book.
Wonderful, thanks very much. Pleasure to be here to discuss this important book. Thanks to Patrik. It's a significant book that makes a really broad contribution on public policy issues and public administration issues. The aging population studies benefit significantly from this, and he should certainly be proud of the book he's produced, even if it took 10 years to get there. Danielle, I'd also like to thank you and MISC for hosting this. These types of events are important. This is actually the first MISC event I've ever participated in, and I was under the impression that it was a bit more like Tout le monde en parle, where we all drank wine and sat around having interesting conversations. But we can at least be assured that we're going to have those interesting conversations, if not the nice glass of wine. Patrik's choice to integrate a public policy and public administration approach to aging policy it's novel, and it's something that's quite frankly refreshing. As a public administration scholar and a public policy scholar myself, you don't often see both of these two important fields of study coupled together. You may get attention to policy theory or applications of policy methods, or you may get just studies of administration of programs and services. And so I think coupling these two fields of study allows Patrik to engage vigorously with questions of who gets what, when, and how, but also the reality around kind of how things get implemented, how administering population aging policy is complex, both in terms of kind of the intra-jurisdictional aspects, but also the scope and magnitude of the issues, in that they touch on a variety of different policy domains, which is very effectively highlighted in choosing contrasting policy domains like pensions with those of home care. You get a sense for kind of the span of this, the scope of what we're dealing with. So obviously an important subject, and I think the rigor with which the comparative analysis was done is helpful in unpacking the views of elites, primarily, and those public servants who do stay between the comings and goings of different ministers and different strategies. In particular, I think confronting how you are, as a society, how we're going to grapple with these meaty, horizontal, if you want to call them wicked problems, is usefully tackled by looking at policy coordination. Coordination is one of those things where everybody wants it. We think we know what it is, but how do you actually achieve it? So from a public administration and policy standpoint, I think that looking at questions of how we coordinate policy responses across a bunch of different domains that touch on issues linked to aging population, as well as the focus on problem definition, adds a lot to the depth of the questions that can be asked and the comparative approach that's undertaken in trying to analyze this. And it fits really well in terms of, again, looking at the elites that are behind the scenes, trying to do the work of articulating what problems are, constructing problems both internally within public service circles, but also obviously with a variety of groups outside of government and with other orders of government. Which I thought was fascinating. The issue of kind of how do governments learn? How do we get the policies we get? Policy diffusion. Also, in terms of how problems are defined differently across the provinces, I think is a fascinating insight that really lets us kind of query and better unpack and understand, from my perspective as someone who doesn't study aging population, I think of it as primarily an economic issue and primarily a health issue. So the health lens, the use of those lenses to me was edifying in the sense of kind of confirming, okay, these are in fact some of the concrete and tangible issues here, but broaden my horizon significantly beyond just thinking about the issues of health or the issues of economics through pensions and intergenerational, to questions of organization and how the state responds, to the social and gerontological view that is something I'm not familiar with. But when I look at my own aging parents, or I look at kind of opportunities to try and create systemic responses to inclusivity and activity and social belonging for seniors, is obviously something that's part of this solution spectrum that Marier identifies. So I think some of the policy topics that are used in concepts strengthen the comparative analysis. Of course, as I said, the four lenses were useful not only to kind of probe the different ways we can think of the problems, we can think of the approaches and the solutions, but also a way to kind of do the important interdisciplinary work that has to happen in public policy to really kind of bring forward the understandings and the insights of people who are in the field. So instead of talking to those pension managers, getting the view of the social workers, getting the views of others who are actually out in the field doing the work. I'm probably best suited to speak to the organizational lens. I'm a public admin guy and a public policy person, and I thought here the treatment was excellent. When I saw a chapter on central agencies, I thought to myself, well, I wasn't expecting that. And we get the thoughtful review of the pertinent literature on central agencies, but then we get this beautiful application of central agencies to coordination and to these discrete policy domains. And that's really helpful to understand that, yes, of course, there's power and levers located at centers of government. And one of their main roles is the coordination of policy issues. But how does that happen? And how does that differ when you look at provincial organizational or cultural structures? Or how does that differ when you're talking about home care, when you're talking about pensions? So I think that, it was really fascinating to see how the attention to central agencies and the role of, for example, leadership, as he highlights in one of the kind of strategies or solutions. We saw it in the Nova Scotia case he highlights, or the Alberta case under Stelmach. So kind of the leader-driven solutions and using those levers in central agencies. But I think what's sobering in the analysis is also attention to things like the lack of finance department's involvement, which, you know, I kind of expected there to be a group of folks working on these types of longer term issues from planning perspectives and all the accounting and financial outlook and strategic policy perspectives. And so I think like this is a real call to action as well to those in finance departments, to perhaps, and those in health, to think about kind of the broader implications of the longer term work that's central to their own ministry's work, but the broader kind of obligations to confront the policy problems. So we're back to Marier's kind of point on coordination, which is hugely important. The question of churn, where initiatives live, you know, is this something that always gets put back into health? You know, strategies that come and go or get moved around. I think it speaks to a broader pathological challenge in public administration of kind of dealing with problems as opposed to just moving the chairs around on the deck, right? And so I think there's some useful application again through the concrete cases of what happens. What happens when you're just constantly moving things and there's a revolving door, that problems need enough time. And maybe the issue of time is something that Patrik will want to further explore in terms of not the longer term issues, but the amount of time required to effectively address a problem itself, right? Similarly, the issue of where things go if they don't fit perfectly in a ministry, right? A lot of the issues that our society is tackling are horizontal, are overlapping, and public administration was built around these silos. And so there's obviously a mismatch between kind of the machinery of government and the processes we build to respond to complex horizontal challenges and our tendency to want to define things in a way that easily places them within a box that can be administered vertically. And this is a long-standing challenge in public administration and public policy scholarship. And so I think that Marier is again offering some insights on strategies to get around this, but also what the impacts are when you start applying this through actual policy domains, what the real costs are. The biggest contribution of the book is in terms of tackling the long-term implications of the lack of long-term thinking. And it's clear that, you know, this is a perfectly chosen issue to confront that because it's something that we're facing and we're heading towards, but how do we start thinking about it now and why aren't we thinking about it more? And I think the concrete and practical strategies around the learning opportunities, the creating the new procedures, the development of strategies were smart and are kind of logical, but are explored in a way that makes them practical again and I think useful, and also highlights where they've worked and haven't worked throughout the text. The strengthening the gatekeepers I thought was fantastic because it was counterintuitive to what I would think of as a gatekeeper, someone keeping something out, but it's really someone keeping a vision and an eye towards the longer term and the role of entrenched public servants or initiatives in that regard. So I think that those are fantastic and raised for me really the question around path dependence and lock-in. So how do we create and institutionalize and embed those types of strategies or those types of policy mechanisms so that they're there and they're harder to shuffle around, that they're going to be able to cumulatively come to some kind of a resolution or a benefit that will help us solve these policy challenges. So whether you're a public servant or whether you're a politico, how do you kind of entrench and lock those in? I also thought a couple other quick points. Politicization, it's obviously linked to short-termism as Marier sets out in the book, but I thought his treatment of it was really interesting, both in terms of how individual actors like in Nova Scotia could kind of navigate around the impact of politicization, but just the comparative treatment of the provinces and politicization and its impact on pensions and home care, I think is really useful. And I would encourage him to continue thinking about a more granular indices or set of instruments that would allow us to kind of have a better handle on how politicization occurs and manifests itself and impacts policies. Laura noted a couple of issues I wanted to speak to. One, I've done some studies myself on capacity and governments. And I think here we see, again, the importance of governments having capacity to do the actual work, whether it's the analytical work in some of the ministries, to be able to kind of use techniques that will create the data required in the analysis and the application of approaches that are going to yield results on long-term thinking, to at least surface those within the system and hope that the administrative cultures of each province will take those and consider them seriously, along with all the other things that have to be considered. So, major strengths in the book are how these concepts of coordination and horizontality are applied through the different domains on the different conceptualizations of the problems and the solutions. And I thought it's always challenging. How do you make those where they intersect and mix? How do you think about those in a thoughtful way? And I think the book, through the cases, demonstrates where there is overlap between the lenses and where there are divisions. And I think that is also a useful tool to identify what are the problems that are particularly vexing, because you've got different problem definitions that are really kind of grinding against each other through the system. So Patrik is probably thinking that I'm going to not offer any criticisms, only laudatory accolades. But in fact, I have some constructive criticisms and future research directions for you, Patrik, and for all of those who are going to read through the book. I want more cases. I want to know how this applies on other topics. Now, perhaps that would have meant 20 years for you to complete the book, but you can perhaps explore other things like taxation, economic development, other social policies, environmental policy through that longer term prism. And I think others will pick up your approach and run with it. It was nice to see the federal role looked at in the pensions chapter in particular, and a bit at the end. But I kind of wondered myself how, where's the federal role in this? How does the federal government overlap in terms of its role in kind of the coordination amongst the provinces? And there are clear examples, like in the Canada Health Act and on the pensions file, that I think there's more room to say more in terms of the federal government's role in creating discretion around some of these policy issues, or attaching conditionalities which direct the governments of provinces to think more long-term because they have to. The provincial politicization point I already raised, but I think more could be done there, and wanted more in terms of how that actually impacts problem definition in particular, or the choice of different instrumentation or solutions. One gap that I saw in the book, I kind of Control F and searched through the manuscript on CARP, the Canadian Association of Retired Persons. So what role do endogenous or exogenous policy entrepreneurs play? So we got some endogenous policy entrepreneurship through officials and other organizational pieces. But what about the organized interests outside of the state? What role do they have to play in kind of putting these issues on the agenda and in working collaboratively with officials, which you did note? And the last one that I'll mention is on questions of the target population. So in the policy world, like, who are we trying to serve here? And I think the target population of aging policy is really interesting, right? So kind of gray power in the role of seniors, and maybe they just have their strategies. They're going to wait us all out until they outnumber us, and then they'll get what they want. But I think that there's another complicated aspect here of the gender, the socioeconomic status, and the composition of aging Canadians that's really interesting, and perhaps is linked to why we see differences in pensions versus home care in terms of those who are able to mobilize resources. That is worth noting. And you talk about this in the rural and urban divide in other areas. So, like, in closing, I think the takeaways here are really the importance of executive federalism as a coordinating mechanism where the officials are formally or informally kind of learning from each other and talking about issues and trying to put issues on the agenda. But that we see the beauty of federalism at work in terms of the province's different responses. And I think the lenses you offer are going to please people like me who are public administration and policy folks. But the other lenses draw attention to kind of issues that are pertinent and need to be surfaced, and I think will lead to a more fulsome conversation. So thanks for the opportunity to join today's panel.
Thank you very much, Jonathan Kraft. So we'll return to Patrik Marier for his response. I want to say, for those who are not specialists of aging, that carp, it's not freshwater fish we are talking about here. And I think Patrik will be able to explain that. Maybe it's supper time soon, so I'm thinking about eating fish. But CARP is an acronym for an association of retired people in Canada. But I will let you, Patrik, respond, and then we'll take questions. I already see one question in the chat box, but please, if you have questions to Patrik Marier, or perhaps also question for Laura and Jonathan, please feel free to write them down in the chat box, and I will read them out loud later so that Patrik and perhaps also Laura and Jonathan can answer. Patrik, it's all yours.
Thank you, Danielle. Well, many thanks to both Jonathan and Laura. And what I like is that, as I was hoping, you did end up providing two very different perspectives in this book. And in many ways, I was trying to bring maybe these two kind of sides together. And especially when Laura mentioned the issues of the power of the seniors. So there's a major gap when we bring this up with social gerontologists and when you bring this up in political science. So in fact, in political science, it's mostly about the power of older adults, how in fact that they are been the ones who've done the best in measures of austerity and sustaining their programs. And then, in fact, if you talk to people mostly involved in home care, right, you will talk with Mason Cup. In many cases, you're going to say, well, we never got the expansion to begin with, right? So that element is particularly interesting. And it is one of those where I first approached the book, I had a very much political science view of this, and it did interview almost in all the provinces the key organizations that represent seniors. But I think this is where the limitation of that argument really comes to the fore. So in many ways, these organizations are extremely potent to defend benefits that are well entrenched. So they usually involve pensions. So it's much more of a defensive mechanism. So we protect what we've already have, what's been well established. It's the same thing, is very potent to also defend, for instance, issues surrounding hospitalizations, right? So the elements that are well defined in the Canada Health Act, there's no problem defending that. They both, and it's also easy to mobilize various seniors groups behind that. It's another story altogether now when we're talking about how to address and promote these other broader issues, where we've actually had poor planning and actually ensuring that we do provide the right services for seniors, most notably home care, and how we ensure that we provide a response that actually does not just focus on older adults, but on the entire population. So that's why I always like also to illustrate these arguments for especially political scientists, right, with home care, and talk about how this intersects with other goals with regard to gender equity, to enhancing labor market participation, sexism, and so on. And that shows that in fact, that it's very complex to actually hit all the right buttons and do it right. So one element, and that also is a source of tension within groups that represent seniors too. So they're not really on the same page. So I was actually, contrary to the US with AARP, which is highly centralized, it's been highly well concentrated. There is a lot of divisions across the country as to what's the organizations that represent seniors. So now the one we've seen leading through COVID is CanAge, but that's fairly recent and has a lot to do with the president, who's actually shown extreme dynamism. But across the countries, there's a lot of tensions in various provinces that can be sometimes based on the rural, urban, or in some cases, different cities that do not like each other. So in terms of a mobilization capacity, it's far more limited than what we have in the literature. And there's also the element that we don't talk a lot, is the nature of the benefit. So cash is easier to illustrate and defend than services, which tends to be a far more complex entity. And there's a lot more fragmentation, a lot more actors involved. So there's many ways upon which you can download and offload responsibilities across. While if you cut the Canada Pension Plan, everybody knows about it and there's nowhere to hide, right? So there's that dynamic element that political scientists are well familiar with. But I think it's worth pointing out. In terms of COVID impact, so I'm going to go two more little quick points. What I like is that it illustrates first how little exchanges there is across provinces. So I did have some specific question as to, well, who do you learn from? So when you have an issues, who do you contact? And what was very surprising to me is that in many cases, it's usually personal contacts. So literally, especially in the smaller provinces, you would hear, I get along very well with so-and-so and this other province. And that, they had been in these positions for a very long time. In some cases, it was ideologically driven, but that tended to come mostly from actors that obtained their positions due to some political appointments, or it's unclear between the two, or they were in the civil service but brought back when another government comes in. But all of this, if we look at how we've dealt with COVID, especially in the early onset and long-term care facilities, like British Columbia was really the first province that tackled that province head-on, and they've learned a lot of lessons from Washington State, and they immediately put a stop to having orderly people, nurses, and other individuals who work in long-term care to actually go from work in one care home to another, because they knew that was actually a source of the spreading of the eclosion in Washington State. But that lesson never seemed to have reached Quebec in the same way, right? So we tend to have our lessons that were from France. and then in many ways in Italy, those were the ones that we actually focused on in the first place. And also, still on COVID impact, another quick little point I wanted to make is how these different power dynamic within the health ministries actually mattered a great deal into the extent to which they cover senior services or not. New Brunswick was stellar on this. Actually, I was almost tempted to write to the province and say, thank you, this is a good point in my book, in the sense that as soon as there was the crisis meeting, the Minister for Social Development was right at the table. So long-term care was clearly at the forefront of their political discussion. If you read the accounts in Quebec, they were nowhere to be found. So that's a clear distinctions between the two. And that speaks to the importance of, yet we have the same scientific evidence in many ways, but when it comes time to provide a political response to it, it was very, very different based on this very different type of institutionalization and policy legacy. And the last element, what's the role of federalism? That's interesting you point this out, because as I was going along in this book, one of the original aim was a bit to include more federalism, but the more I got into this book, the more I thought it was important to focus more squarely on the province. But you're totally right. I mean, federalism actually is involved in all of these policies areas in very different ways, and actually does change the dynamic. And I think in some cases, enhance the learning and policy response, especially if you think about senior secretariat. There's a reason where a lot of these kind of healthy aging initiatives spread so rapidly, because there was a broad consensus at the federal, provincial, territorial table. But you don't see these kind of positive exchange with health where they're always haggling about money. But I think there's also ways in which federalism actually makes exchanges, or actually complicate a lot of the policy a lot further than they need to. And with regards to COVID, and I think the intervention of the federal government and long-term care is a clear illustration, because it ignores that over the past 30 and 40 years, provinces have enacted these policies on their own with very different manners to do this, right? If you think about Ontario, it's a clear legacy of the Irish government, where privatization clearly led the way. So if you're enforcing standardization, for instance, well, that means it's these big private company and consortium that would be lobbying the government, and these are the type of standardization standards you're most likely to get, which is also the same type of issues that frighten a province like New Brunswick. So people rejected the premier's criticism to this. Well, their long-term care facilities are run by nonprofit that are strongly embedded in the community. So they do not want these kind of big standardization criteria that would put them on the wrong side of the equation, or with limited ways to actually have a strong input into this. But on that note, so many thanks, and I maybe let the audience give some questions.